Chakshurunmilitam yena tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadha Mahyam Dadati Swapadantikam. Hariyam Tat Sat. So yesterday we began our reading together of Ragvartma Chandrika, which means the moon rays which shine light on the path of Raganuga Bhakti. The reason for the necessity of shining light on the path of Raganuga Bhakti, and this is a point that I didn't bring up yesterday, but it's important. I forgot to bring it up yesterday, is that although the explanation of Vaidhi Bhakti and Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu is very elaborate, when Srila Rupa Goswami discusses the practices of Raganuga Bhakti, it's very brief, only 3 verses. So the subject matter of Vaidhi Bhakti got over 200 verses explanation, and Raganuga Bhakti only got 3 in terms of its practice. And probably as a result of Srila Rupa Goswami's, we'll say, eloquence. The word eloquent, as defined by Kaviraj Goswami, is truth spoken concisely. So Srila Rupa Goswami was extremely eloquent when it came to his revelation of the path of Raganuga Bhakti. And as a result of his extreme eloquence, you can say that led to novelty developing around the practice of Raganuga Bhakti and Gaudiya Vaishnavism. For example, what came to be known as traditional Gaudiya Vaishnava practice was what you will hear most followers of Srila Saraswati Thakur, meaning Prabhupada's movement also, we disparagingly say Siddha Pranali line. You hear this word, also you see in Prabhupada's books, the so-called Siddha Pranali or whatever. And the word Siddha Pranali just literally means, Pranali means a line of siddhas. That is what the word Siddha Pranali literally means. And that became known as a traditional understanding of Gaudiya Vaishnava practice before Srila Saraswati Thakur revolutionized Krishna conscious practice for the post-industrial world. But that Siddha Pranali line, anyway, not going into all the details of that's big history there. That Siddha Pranali line was a novelty that was certainly based on what Srila Rupa Goswami gave in the 3 verses of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, but he himself, nor did any of the Goswamis elaborate in any way, in terms of the path that was given by the Siddha Pranali people. That was a novelty. It was certainly based on Srila Rupa Goswami's foundational expression in BRS, undoubtedly, I suspect at least, giving the benefit of the doubt. But the Goswamis, nor did Srila Rupa Goswami himself elaborate such details as what came to be known as the traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And Srila Saraswati Thakur, yesterday was his appearance day, so just saying a little bit about that. He saw himself as a sort of coming back to the foundational teachings of the Goswamis, which emphasized Harinam Sankirtan and a sort of internal revelation of a lot of these esoteric realities, as opposed to the Siddha Pranali novelty, which kind of the novelty kind of applied a sort of fake it till you make it approach. That's probably not the fairest, that's not the most charitable way of describing that, but a sort of makeshift imposition of an identity, basically. They basically gave you or gifted you an identity, and you use that identity to practice Krishna consciousness until you could fully step into that identity or embody that particular identity. So that's kind of the history, a little bit of the history. And the reason I'm saying that is that there needs to be revelation or some light shined on the path of Raganuga Bhakti because Rupa Goswami was so brief about it. So how to apply it properly and so on would be very, we would need some instruction on that matter. So we discussed that yesterday. We then went and looked at the first two verses of the book, which is described, it was his Mangalacharan, that was the first verse. And then in this second verse, what was the second verse? I forgot in my little review. And the second verse, let me just pull it up now. Oops, wrong book. Here we are. Yeah, in the second verse, he mentions how he briefly discussed it in his own summary review of BRS, but now he wants to describe it elaborately. So he begins. So we're going to look at text 3, 4, 5, and number 6 today. Let's see here. Let me share my screen. So here in these verses, he wants to describe the basic condition, the cause for Raganuga Bhakti, the sort of qualification that cause gives to an individual, the symptoms of that cause, and then the cause of that cause. These are the 4 topics in these 4 verses that we'll look at today. Starting with text number 3, which he wants to describe what is the cause of Raganuga Bhakti by contrasting it with the cause of Vaidhi Bhakti. So this we kind of already discussed yesterday when I gave the definitions of Vaidhi and Raganuga Bhakti, but we'll see it here again mentioned. So he says here, this is text 3, just reading the English here. So he says, devotion impelled by injunctions of the scriptures is called Vaidhi Bhakti. And devotion incited by spiritual greed or lobha is called Raganuga Bhakti. So the distinction between Vaidhi and Raganuga Bhakti is not so much in its external form, but in its internal substance. That's basically what he's telling us here. The compelling force for the application of bhakti. So in Vaidhi Bhakti, as we already defined yesterday, the compelling force is the injunctions of Shastra. Due to either motivation or due to fear of negligence, then someone may perform Vaidhi Bhakti. And that is according to the scriptures. So there's a strong element of fear as the compelling force for the application of Vaidhi Bhakti. This is not to say that Vaidhi Bhakti is impure, because whether Vaidhi type or Raganuga type, in order for it to qualify as a sadhana of Uttama Bhakti, it must be pure, right? Anya bilashita shunyam gyana karmadya navritam anukuyena Krishna nushila nambhaktir Uttama. So this definition of pure bhakti applies to both Vaidhi sadhana and Raganuga sadhana. So it is not to diminish the glory of Vaidhi bhakti by saying that, oh, it's compelled by scriptural injunction, nana nana boo boo, or something like that. Like you want to, not to say like that, but when you follow some injunction because of some inner motivation. You either want something or there is fear of negligence. So this is the reason for following any injunction, whether it's a cultural injunction or a social one or a moral one. Then there is usually, you want to be seen as, astute for following it, or you're fear of the consequences of not doing so. Such is the nature of following injunctions. And so there's an element of fear in Vaidhi Bhakti. But here in Raganuga Bhakti, we're being told the cause is lobha. Lobha is the cause by which one follows the residents of Braj, the residents of Braj. And we defined Raganuga Bhakti yesterday. We virajantam abhivyaktam brajavasi janadishu. And then we anushrita, remember this word anushrita, ragatmikam anushritaye. So ragatmikam anushrita means to follow the ragatmika devotees. And then we define what is ragatmika bhakti also. So there's anushrita, which means to follow, or as I was mentioning yesterday, in some sense, it means to imitate or to emulate the ragatmika pure devotional archetypes. Why would you want to do that? So there's a greed to do so. It is this inner greed that is a compelling factor for following. So lobha is the force behind wanting to follow versus fear of negligence of scriptural edicts as a compelling force. So he's informing us of this in this particular verse. So one of the commentaries I was looking at, Srila Jiva Goswami's Bhakti Sandarbha was referenced here, and it's an interesting reference that I want to read to you all. This is, the reference comes in Anucheta 310, which is toward the end of the book. The Bhakti Sandarbha, as you may be familiar with, is divided into 3 sections. The first section basically just makes a case for Bhakti, Sadhana Bhakti as the Abhideya of the Bhagavatam. That is basically the whole first part of Bhakti Sandarbha. The second part of Bhakti Sandarbha wants to say Bhakti is the Abhideya by glorification of Bhaktas, because there is no question of doing Bhakti without the association of Bhaktas. So Jiva Goswami basically says the same thing in the second part, but through the glorification of Vaishnava, not only the glorification, but the breakdown of Vaishnava Tattva or Bhakti Tattva. And then in the last portion of Bhakti Sandarbha, he gets into the actual practices of Bhakti. And he begins, like Srila Rupa Goswami, by first giving an elaborate discussion on Vaidhi Bhakti. And then after that elaborate discussion on Vaidhi Bhakti, he concludes the Bhakti Sandarbha with a discussion on Raganuga Bhakti. So that is the sort of structure of the Bhakti Sandarbha. So starting with Anucheta 310, that is where he begins his discussion on on Raganuga Bhakti. So you can go check it out for yourself. It's a very interesting, I was reading it throughout the night because another sleepless night. My body clock is still wacko right now. Anyway, a very interesting section, this section, but I wanted to read it for for one part, just to help describe in more detail the compelling force, the inner force behind each of these 2 types of sadhanas, which is clarified therein. So in 310, the way the Anucheta opens up, I'm just giving a quick summary here. He mentions that everyone has raga. You have raga too. I also have raga and dvesha, of course, because we're in the duality world, so our raga is connected with dvesha. But the nature of our raga is such that, and Jiva Goswami gives this example, he says, just like when the eye is spontaneously attracted to form, beautiful forms that means, or the nose is spontaneously attracted to sense, right? The tongue is spontaneously attracted to taste and so on, their respective sense objects. So no one has to give education. Hey, eyes should look at form, ears should hear sound. No one needs education. There's a spontaneous attraction to pleasurable corresponding sense objects, an aversion to that which gives us pleasure. So that raga is fixed in us in the material world, right? Krishna says as such in Bhagavad Gita 3:24, Indriyas indriyasyarte raga dvesha vyavastito. He said as raga dvesha is fixed in our senses, and he says fixed in the sense objects, which means to say it's fixed in our senses, so we're spontaneously attracted to all sorts of things, good and bad, a lot of bad things. If you look at Sri Baladev Vidibhushana's commentary, he says that we have raga for things like associating with another man's wife, and we have dvesha for associating with sadhus. So he said this is how the raga dvesha is fixed in the conditioned cells. Anyway, he gives that interesting example. So just as we have this raga, so the eternal associates in the spiritual world, they also have raga. But their raga is for the perfect object of devotion, which is Krishna. And according to the nature of their abhimana, abhimana means their self-identity. According to the nature of their abhimana, they have a corresponding raga, right? Just like in the material world, someone identifies as a man or a woman. So according to that identity, they have an attraction to a certain type of, let's say, romantic partner, for example, right? But it's according to the identity. As a sidebar now, because the world is going completely insane, they have this new non-binary category that is very popular here in New York City. Sometimes I see it in the Bhakti Center. So I wonder, with such an unclear identity, their raga also is a little messed up, a little funny. But generally, there's a congruence with your abhimana and your raga. So in the spiritual world, they all have a certain abhimana as the friend of Krishna, parent of Krishna, lover of Krishna, servant of Krishna, son of Krishna, and so on. So according to that abhimana, they have a certain raga for Krishna. So he opens up this section by describing that, making this analogy. And then he says this thing, and this is the part I wanted to read, which is very interesting. Also, this explanation of Jiva Goswami echoes the definition of Ragatmika Bhakti that we discussed in brief yesterday. If you remember the definition of raga given by Srila Rupa Goswami, Ishte Swarasiki Raga Parama Vishtataphavet, right? He defines raga as the spontaneous love thirst, which causes complete absorption in Krishna. So swabhaviki, this is an important word, is inherent and spontaneous. Swarasiki means like spontaneously flowing, just as our senses spontaneously flow towards their objects. So that breakdown basically echoes Srila Rupa Goswami's own definition of Ragatmika Bhakti in VRS. And then he says this, now this is important, this whole little section is very important just in terms of also the history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism and Srila Saraswati Thakur's own sort of reformation of the sadhana, which is probably his most major contribution to the world, and also the contribution for which he is probably criticized the most. He's criticized for a lot of things. He's criticized for his idea of a parampara of shiksha gurus, without showing a certain allegiance to a diction line, but saying you just take shiksha from that one and that one. Wherever the siddhas are found, that is our guru parampara. So he's criticized for that. He's criticized for his application of Yukta Vairagya, where he would be seen sometimes wearing fancy clothes and driving nice fancy cars in order to preach Krishna consciousness. And he was a sannyasin, so he was criticized for that. But all the criticisms of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta and the ones that still are, if you associate with different sadhus, especially in Braj, at least I'm familiar with a little bit there, the main criticism that they offer to Srila Bhakti Siddhanta and those who came after him, Gaudiya Math, ISKCON, and so on, is his reformation or his, what they would consider to be a novel presentation on the path of sadhana bhakti. And that's where a lot of the tension between ISKCON, Gaudiya Math followers and these other Gaudiya groups in Braj, the tension is there. It's still there even to this day, some tension is there. And it comes from this thing. So this little section of Jiva Goswami's Bhakti Sandarbha is kind of important in defense of why Srila Bhakti Siddhanta did what he did in anticipation of a post-industrial world where sense gratification is at the heart of, sense gratification and consumption is at the heart of such a world, and therefore his need to reform the way sadhana was looked at. It has a very solid basis here in Bhakti Sandarbha. So I'm just going to read this little part. It's very interesting. So having described the raga, he goes on to say this. So the raga exists in the eternal associates, the nitya siddhas. So we can't, we're following that. We don't have Ragatmika Bhakti, we're aspiring for that. So having talked about the perfected souls, now he wants to speak about Raganuga Bhakti, because Bhakti Sandarbha is about sadhana. So it goes on, I'm reading now, he says this. So he says, when a simple taste has appeared in a devotee for a specific raga among those previously mentioned, like the lovers of Krishna, etc. Yet prior to the appearance of that particular raga itself, so they don't have the raga, but they have a simple taste for a specific raga without actually having that raga, okay? Then the devotee, now here's an important line, then a devotee whose crystal-like heart shines with the reflected rays of the moon of that raga, develops a taste also for the methods of that type of Ragatmika Bhakti. Okay, I'm gonna read that line again. Then the devotee whose crystal-like heart, so why are you saying crystal-like heart? So when the crystal is clean, then it can reflect, light, or if some object comes in front of that crystal, then it will take on the color of the thing that's placed in front of it, right? That's what we usually give that example to describe upadi, right? If the crystal is clear, clean, then you put a red rose in front of it and the crystal looks red, right? So here he says, then the devotee who has a simple taste for a raga, I like that, simple taste. Then the devotee whose crystal-like heart shines with the reflected rays of the moon of that raga. So the idea here, I was trying to see the commentary here that I have in Bhakti Sundar doesn't mention it, but I saw it in another commentary that had to do a little research. So the crystal is reflecting the rays of the raga. So if the crystal is not clean, it cannot reflect any ray of the raga. And this is basically Srila Bhakti Siddhanta's point, that if you try to give initiation to people who don't have a sufficiently clarified heart, right? Their heart isn't, in other words, filled with a lot of nasty things and basically material desires, and attraction to matter is very strong. And then how will the ray come in that heart? How will it be reflected in a heart that is too much dirtied or obfuscated with, so many things? So the heart should be like crystal, a little bit like crystal here. And we're going to read on. We're going to read this whole little thing because Jiva Goswami even offers a verse from Bhagavatam that really kind of takes it home. So he says here, I'm going to read this line again. So when a simple taste has appeared in the devotee for a specific raga among those previously mentioned, yet prior to the appearance of that particular raga itself, then the devotee whose crystal-like heart shines with the reflected rays of the moon of that raga develops a taste also for the methods of that type of ragatmika bhakti, about which he has heard from scripture or from his teacher. Thereafter, the bhakti of this devotee, following the raga of a particular associate of Bhagavan impelled by taste, proceeds as raganuga. So I'm going to read a little bit more, but the important point here is that ruchi is the impelling factor here. So what is called as lobha by Srila Rupa Goswami is basically called as ruchi here by Jiva Goswami. There's a ruchi, like a natural taste, that I like that, or I find that attractive. And Sri Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur is going to elaborate on that in text 5. Hopefully we get to it a little bit. I have some attraction to that. And when the heart is clear and the light or moon ray of that raga is shining in the heart, then more and more inspiration comes to embody that type of bhakti. And you become more and more inspired to take up the methods, or basically to emulate the speaking, feeling, and willing of those ragatmika devotees. And when your bhakti is impelled simply by that taste, not because someone told you to do it, not because Shastra says, right? Just like all the time we're saying, what is your Shastra Pramana, right? What is your Shastra Pramana? And if it doesn't have Shastra Pramana, then, it's not bona fide. Nope, this is not impelled by Shastra Pramana. And Sri Vishwanath's going to make this point in just a second. Nope, it's just that taste is there and it's becoming more and more powerful. And then your bhakti, you take out the practices of bhakti, the practices of emulating or stepping into that archetype by devotional methods, impelled by ruchi, then this is called as Raganuga Bhakti. He goes on to say, I'm reading on a little bit more here. Some people refer to Raganuga Bhakti as non-prescribed devotion, avihita bhakti, because it is impelled only by taste and not by scriptural injunctions. It should not, however, be claimed that bhakti is not at all possible for a person who is not subservient to scriptural injunctions. So this is an argument that Jiva Goswami wants to counter. So the Purva Mimamsaka people, the Purva Mimamsaka people, we're called as Uttara Mimamsa, right? The Vedantins. And the Purva Mimamsaka people are the Karmis, basically. So they say that if you don't follow Dharma, as mentioned in Shastra, then there can be no question of auspiciousness. There can be no question of attaining artha. Artha means the desired goal. If you want to obtain any desired goal, you have to follow the Dharma mentioned in Shastra, right? So here, Jiva Goswami wants to, so they're saying because this bhakti, and Dharma means following the Shastra Vidhi. That's what Dharma means for the Purvamimamsaka people specifically. And also, as we heard in study of chapter 1 of the 6th canto, Dharma means to follow the Shastra Vidhis, right? The Vidhis of the Vedas. So this fellow, this Raganuga Bhakta, I have Ruchi, and he doesn't follow Shastra Vidhi. So they say how there will be auspiciousness for this person. So Jiva Goswami wants to make a statement about that. So he says here, it should not, however, be claimed that bhakti is not at all possible for a person who is not subservient to scriptural injunctions. For Sri Shuka has said, and he quotes a verse from second canto, chapter 1, where Shukadeva Goswami is talking about himself here. He says, O king, those sages who are beyond the injunctions and prohibitions of scripture and situated on the Nirgun platform, free from material influence, nearly always delight in recounting the virtues of Bhagavan Hari. Why is he quoting this verse? He wants to show that the Atmaramas do not follow Shastra Vidhi, right? The Atmaramas do not follow Shastra Vidhi, but they become attracted to bhakti and do bhakti. So there is a possibility of doing bhakti without being compelled by Shastra Vidhi. That's the reason for quoting this particular verse here in context. So this is meant to defeat the Purvamimamsaka people who say that there can be no auspiciousness by not following Shastra Vidhi. Okay, he goes on to say here, now this is where it brings it on home. Therefore, it is to be understood that Vaidhi Bhakti is comparatively weak because it depends on scriptural injunctions. Whereas Raganuga is extraordinarily powerful, being self-impelled, independent of scriptural injunctions. Example is given, very simple. It is like taking some rock candy because you have jaundice and you have to take it because it's medicine. Versus after you get cured of the jaundice, then you also take rock candy, or in my case, when I was in Vrindavan, Snickers. They have the vegetarian Snicker. It was very nice. I was eating too many of them. So if you have sickness, jaundice, you cannot, when you eat rock candy, I don't know if this applies to Snickers also, but I bet it does. Then it tastes very bitter. So, but you take it because it is good for you. So that Snickers is your medicine. But after the jaundice goes away, that Snickers is your, well, in my case, maybe your breakfast sometimes, or your appetizer before your meal, and your dessert also. In other words, you're impelled by your natural taste. So this way, bhakti impelled by ruchi is more potent or powerful. That's what he's saying here. Consequently, the symptom that Raganuga has appeared within a practitioner is indicated by the absence of attraction for anything unrelated to bhakti. That's a pretty strong statement. Consequently, the symptom that Raganuga has appeared within a practitioner is indicated by the absence of attraction for anything unrelated to bhakti. This is pointed out by Sri Vidura in the 3rd canto, quote, that predilection for hearing Harikatha, developing in the heart of a person endowed with faith, begets detachment from all other pursuits. For the person who is absorbed in the bliss of remembering the feet of Sri Hari, that predilection to hear Harikatha quickly dispels all his miseries. And that's the end of the quote. So anyway, and it goes on. There's some very fascinating information here in the Bhakti Sundarbha. The reason I wanted to read this is because this statement is a justification for Srila Bhakti Siddhanta's conservatism in regards to subject matter of Raganuga Bhakti. And it is the conservatism that we have inherited in ISKCON also. Unfortunately, the conservatism that we inherited lacked historical context for the most part. And as we know, first impressions are very powerful and hard to eradicate. even when there's loads of evidence showing that the thing that you're afraid of, for example, is not really a thing, for example, like in modern geopolitical situation, first impressions are very hard to eradicate. So since our first impression of the subject matter of Raganuga Bhakti was an inheritance of the conservatism of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta, which is more or less following this statement of Srila Jiva Goswami, at least that's my suggestion here. We came as a group, at least, to consider the subject matter, the property of sahajiyas and the so-called Siddha Pranali and so on, and have not valued that this actually is the, as we were mentioning in yesterday's class also, this sort of bhakti is the bhakti that the Sri Chaitanya, Krishna, Sri Chaitanya and the Goswamis are actually trying to distribute to the people of this world. Prema rasa niryasa karite aswadana rag marg bhakti loke karite prachara. This verse is stated by Kaviraj Goswami describing Krishna's desire. Krishna's desire was to taste the prema rasa of the Brijbasis. And after tasting the rasa of the Brijbasis, the prema rasa of the Brijbasis, he wanted to preach the rag marg to the people of this world. That was Krishna's desire. He didn't do a very good job. So he was like, I need to come back in Kali Yuga and try again. And he realized that in order for me to be able to more potently do that, I have to adopt the inner life of a Brijbasi. Otherwise, how will I distribute it? So he becomes Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He is Krishna who is endowed with the mood of Radha. Right? In other words, he's taken on the inner life of a Brijbasi. Then he became very powerful distributor of Raganuga Bhakti or preacher Raganuga Bhakti. So any true follower of Gaudiya Vaishnavism is also going to be interested in preaching this. What are we preaching? Just how bad the material world is. Boring. That is not what we're preaching. I remember once I've been in Braj, this was years ago, and there was Kirtan, there was this one boy, his name was Kartik. He was from the Gurukul there in Vrindavan. Gurukul was there. And he would always come to Kirtan. So he was friends with all of us guys who were in the Kirtan party. So one time I asked him, I said, what is the purpose of Krishna conscious movement? And he said, to get purified. And I was like, ew, that's such a low understanding. And he was actually taking it back when I retorted like that. I said, that's not the purpose of the Krishna conscious movement. The purpose of sadhana bhakti is to get bhav. So in that sense, the purpose is bhav bhakti. That is the purpose of sadhana. But what type of bhav? And what type of sadhana to get that type of bhav? So, preaching Krishna consciousness or inheriting the wealth of Krishna consciousness means inheriting this. Still, having said all of that, we can see why Srila Prabhupada and before him, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had a sort of conservatism in their presentation. Because here, Ruchi, or Srila Rupa Goswami's word is lobha, means a sort of preoccupation with bhakti, with an absence of attraction to things that are not bhakti. So that itself seems like a very powerful, kind of high level thing. And it kind of gives a justification. If you read Nectar of Devotion, I'm sure many of you have, but you'll see that Prabhupada has mentioned a statement where he says something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing here, that genuine lobha doesn't happen until after anarshana vritti. And you'll find a lot of the guys in different lines in Braja, they have issue with this. Most of them were started off in ISKCON, by the way. The guys that fight with us were in ISKCON for like 10 or 15 years, and then they left because they got something better, whatever. And then they fight with us like this. So they say, well, Prabhupada's wrong because this ruchi or loba, as we'll come to see the next verses, comes by grace. And grace can come at any stage in life, which is true. But in defense of what Prabhupada has said, if we take Jiva Goswami's words at least to be true, if this ruchi means a preoccupation with bhakti, and an absence of attraction to non-bhakti, then that ruchi sounds like a pretty high thing. And that is the adhikar for his practice. So anyway, there is a little bit of a mix of a little bit of historical context. There's an article you all should read. Yesterday was Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's Appearance Day. I've read it. I think I've read it with this group. Maybe not. The article is written by Srila Damodar Maharaj, actually. It's called Srila Bhaktisiddhanta and Raghunuga Bhakti. You can find it on his website, which I think is called Ways of Devotion. So there he's trying to defend Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's vindicate. That's not the best word, because not that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta needs to be vindicated, but it's sort of like an apologetic work where he's trying to demonstrate why Srila Bhaktisiddhanta reformed our understanding. And he actually brings up a lot of these references there. It's a super excellent article. And in honor of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, which I probably should have mentioned this yesterday, you may take advantage of that article, which is quite long, as it pertains to the subject matter at hand, and it's very interesting. Okay, I'm going to pause here. I wanted to do 4, 5, 6, but we'll do 4, 5, 6 tomorrow, and maybe move on from there. Anyway, the simple point summary is that the compelling force for Vaidhi Bhakti is Shastra Vidhi. The compelling force for Raganuga Bhakti is Lobha, or Srila Jiva Goswami uses the word Ruchi. And therefore, you'll see this phrase come up later in Bhakti Sundar. We will not get to it, but just throwing it out there. Vidhi Pradhan and Ruchi Pradhan devotees. So Vidhi Pradhan means predominated by Vidhi. Shastra says to do it. Versus Ruchi Pradhan, predominated by Ruchi. So this is going to become important in the next couple of verses. So we'll get to that later. Okie dokie. I'm pausing there for now and see if anyone wants to bring up something here. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at a private message. I think it's yeah, so my Snickers issue was being brought up in a private message. Okay, Mukunda's gonna say something here. Jaya, let's hear it.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Yeah, so I guess maybe kind of like a comment/question. Obviously, Vaidhi Bhakti being characterized by someone performing bhakti as a duty based on the fact that scripture says it should be done. And then Raganuga Bhakti being performed because someone has some greed. And I feel like a lot of devotees, I mean, I would definitely say myself, I almost, now that I think about it, I don't practice Krishna consciousness because Shastra says so, as much as because I've experienced something by practicing it in proximity of devotees that are experiencing something, And it's more like devotees are making me want to practice Krishna consciousness, and it's like a +1 that Shastra backs it up, So I don't know. I mean, I guess it's still within the realm of Vaidhi, but I was wondering what your thoughts are on that. The fact that devotees are kind of compelling us more than Shastra.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Sri Vishwanath's going to elaborate on this a little bit more than the subsequent statements, but basically, what accompanies the ruchi is the notion that may that type of bhakti come in me. So, as we were mentioning earlier in the class, that for every raga, there's a corresponding abhimana, right? So you have, if you're, for example, have the identity of a husband, and then with that identity, there's a certain sort of attraction to the wife, for example. So the two are congruent. So in the case of this Raganuga Bhakti or this ruchi, you are attracted to the identity and the corresponding raga that is fixed with that identity. He said, may that come to me. In other words, we want to shift our sense of identity. Right now, our sense of identity is linked to the material body, which is going to be disappointing. In one sense, you can say the existential crisis of the soul is that we're trying to find out who we are. And not only in terms of being 1/10,000 the tip of the hair nobody, using Ayanjaru's language, but in terms of something that's everlasting attractive. That's why we keep grabbing onto bodies life after life. Maybe this will be the one, maybe this will be the one. Of course, anything material ultimately fails us. So then finally, the idea in Gaudiya Vaishnavism is to get attached to the identity of, to get attached to an imperishable identity. So the imperishable identities are in the spiritual world. And those imperishable identities have their raga. So you hear about that, you think, mate, I want to step into that identity. That's not the best language, but may that come in me. So that is really, that is the fully awakened is not the word I'm looking for, fully expanded explanation of Loba or Ruchi. But to your point also, our bhakti is not so much impelled by Shastra Praman. We're just kind of like associating with devotees, and in their company, we are empowered to do practice. So in that sense, that is still Vaidhi Bhakti, only because if the notion for embodying an identity and a certain loving identity doesn't come in us, so then it's Vaidhi Bhakti, whatever it is. If you're doing bhakti out of gratitude, or you're doing bhakti out of fear, or whatever it is, aside from the desire to embody a particular identity and the loving attraction of that identity, then it is Vaidhi Bhakti. But it just speaks to your comment speaks to the importance of sadhu sangha. That without sadhu sangha, we don't have the independent power to do bhakti. So that's why Prabhupada has that statement. I often have mentioned it in 4911, where he says that those who think they could practice Krishna consciousness outside the association of devotees is living in a great hallucination. So practicing devotees, even if they're not very advanced, they're because they practice, they chant, they hear, et cetera, et cetera. That's like being in the association of the internal energy. However small it is, just like if it is cold, even though a small fire can be very attractive and empowering, it warms you up. So your comment kind of speaks to the necessity of sadhu sangha for the maintenance and hopefully growth of our bhakti. If not growth, at least the maintenance, depending on the sort of sangha that we're getting. So yeah, that would be that's my comment to your comment. It just speaks of I mentioned this a lot last year, but when I was in North Carolina, I was living with devotees, but they weren't practicing. So I was like, nah, I gotta get out of here, because it was like it's like being in darkness on a cold night with no fire, not even a small one around. So then you'll go cold. We have no independent strength to do bhakti. So you'll hear so many songs like that of our acharyas also. So that's my comment to that comment. Okay.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Jaya.
Haribol. I really liked what Mukunda Prabhu had to say. It reminded me of the Jamil in your answer, that Shastra doesn't necessarily have to be prevalent. And also thank you so much, Prabhu, for reading from the Bhakti Sandarbha. That was fantastic, showing kind of where Srila Bhakti Siddhanta and Srila Prabhupada are coming from in this being purified before taking on Raganuga and connecting that with Ruchi. That was mind-blowing. Really enjoyed that. And so my question is, now that you've made that point, I'm curious, because I remember when we were discussing Raganuga Bhakti and when Loba can come, I believe you said that Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur said that it can come at any stage, like super early. So I'm just curious, is this just like a different angle of vision? Because you pretty much just made a case for Jiva Goswami saying that it comes at Ruchi, and as we, I'm sure the Prabhupada says.
Let me clarify. He doesn't say it comes at Ruchi, but he's using the word ruchi as a synonym for loba, basically, which gives an adhikar for treading the path of Raganuga Bhakti. So he doesn't say at the stage of ruchi it comes, but he says that this ruchi is the loba that gives the adhikar for the practice of Raganuga Bhakti. So when does it come? How does it come? That is about to come up. So it comes by Vaishnava Sangha generally, or it can come by the mercy of Krishna also. So we already mentioned that yesterday. Sri Rupa Goswami tells, that's the last verse of the 7th section of BRS. And Sri Vishnu is going to echo that here in the next statement or so. He will also say that. So we're just making a case that this ruchi or this loba, if it appears, now it can appear at any stage, because grace can come at any stage of life. You could be a nonsense number on the street and you get some mercy, like Margari the hunter, and boom, you have a life-changing moment. So how does one know, at least for oneself, or what is the indicator? So it seems from what we're hearing Bhakti Sundar, the indicator is that you become preoccupied with bhakti, with an absence of attraction to non-bhakti. Not as an intellectually informed thing, like as a very natural thing, that you're just like, somehow you're into that and there's a non-attraction to non-devotion. So with that being like a characteristic of genuine loba or ruchi, in that regard, I'm saying, Srila Prabhupada's point that after a narshana vritti, a person can become genuinely fixed on the path of Raganuga Bhakti. That becomes possible only after narshana vritti. He might have a point there, that's what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. Now, it doesn't mean that the person, because the other factor for getting attracted to Raganuga Bhakti, aside from this sort of crystal-like heart, is that you have the notion that I want to be a Brijbasi. I want that sort of love. So if that never happens to you, and that notion comes to you from hearing from bhaktas. So if that never happens to you, then you might just take, after Narana just carry on Vaidhi path until you get Bhav Bhakti. But if after a Narana Vritti and you go on hearing Krishna Lila and you think, oh, I'm very attracted to that, and it comes in you, then you can say genuine loba to tread the path of Rag Marg. Genuine loba in terms of the non-attraction to non-bhakti. Now that can happen to a person at the very beginning of their life also, or Krishna conscious life by some extraordinary mercy also. Not that it has to happen in that particular sequence, but just if we had to make a case for that, so we were making a case for that.
So if it comes at an earlier stage or at the beginning, then you said the adhikar is that they get this taste. So does that mean that they would just immediately advance through all these stages? Like once they receive it, because then they don't have any more material desires. So they're past, all of these lower stages immediately. Is that what's implied?
They have to go through those stages also, but they go through them quickly. So Sri Vishnu's going to say that at the end of this book also.
Okay.
So it says that these people, they also have to go through all the stages we hear in reference to Vaidhi Bhakti. They also go through these stages, but they'll go through very rapidly because they are really into Bhakti. They are ruchi. They like eating Snickers. So overcoming obstacles is very easy and kind of powerful for them. Whereas if you're not having that genuine ruchi, then you might require some support from Vaidhi Bhakti. And Jiva Goswami has a term for that person also. Because you can say, in one sense, as Gaudiya Vaishnavas, even from hearing classes like this one or others, we are attracted to the Brijbasis. And many of us may even have the notion of, I want to be a gopi. I want to be a gopa. Not in like in a ruchi pradhan sense that we're hearing about today, but in the sense that I'm supposed to be attracted to that. And I kind of am also attracted to it. I'm attracted to the notion of communing with God and divine love in that particular way. I actually am genuinely attracted to that, but I'm not so attracted to it that I'm also not attracted to non-bhakti. I like non-bhakti too. Non-bhakti is also appealing. So we don't have the ruchi that gives us the full permission, so to speak, to tread on the path of Raganuga Bhakti. So in that case, Jiva Goswami is giving a term to those sorts of people also, where he says, Ajata Ruchi, Raganuga Bhaktas. So Ajata means not yet taking birth. So Ajata Ruchi, so the Ruchi, as we've just heard about it, is not yet fully awakened, but they're still Raganuga Bhaktas. How? Because they have some notion, at least the bare minimum notion, that I want to be a Brij Basi. And with certain people, according to their association, they may even have the notion that I want to be like a Manjari or a Gopa, or that depends on Sangha, how they do Sangha. So they have that thing in their head. So, but they're Ajata Ruchi because they don't have that full Ruchi that causes the absence of attraction to non-bhakti. So for those Ajata Ruchi, Raganuga Bhaktas, they need support of the Vaidhi Bhakti elements. So Jiva Goswami mentions that. And then they have to make progress. And then when they go through Anartha Vritti, it seems, now this is my suggestion at least, then that Ruchi becomes very strong. That Ruchi becomes devoid of the other attraction. So now you have full permission to just charge. So in this sense, that makes sense to me, honestly. Like, I really appreciate this angle of vision of Srila Saraswati Thakur and, Gaudiya Math is kind of after that. Because the other method also or at least was a genuine method, but as it stands today, I don't know. I mean, I've heard stories, I know stories of people who, got the Siddha Pranali Diksha and then later on became Buddhist. I don't know directly. Damodar Maharaj is telling me of people that he personally knew. They, went and got the Diksha Pranali, Siddha Pranali, which means they give you your register root, 11 aspects are there. And then later on they became Buddhists, like legit atheists. So how does that happen? So there's something to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's conservatism. It happens because it may be a false imposition on an impurified mind, so it creates complications. So I like this, it makes sense to me.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. And I really appreciate that term you used, Ajata Ruchi Raganuga.
We can read about it later. It is there only. Jiva Goswami is telling us thing here. It's the last part of this discussion, yeah. Okay, Adina said, how can they be devotees if they don't practice? Yeah, they accept Krishna as the Swayam Bhagavan. They accept that they should be doing bhakti, they're just not doing it. So they are devotees in that sense. They accept Krishna's supremacy. They go to the festivals at least, but they don't really practice so much, aside from going to festivals and taking prasadam. So they're still devotees in a general sense. You can say Bhakta Abbas if you want to be a little bit mean about it. Vaishnava Praya, you can call it like that if you want to be. It's also precise, but it's a little bit mean. You can call them almost a Vaishnava. Vaishnava Praya means almost a devotee. Or Bhakta Abbas means a semblance of a devotee. But they are devotees. They just, present moment, not practicing, because of lack of sufficient association or whatever the case may be. Or devotee bandhu. Oh my God. That's also a little mean. Sham Gopi says, I never understand Siddha Pranali. How can someone give you your Siddha Rupa? Isn't it cultivated individually? How will Guru, their disciple? So again, the word Siddha Pranali means a line of siddhas, right? So the word siddha means a perfected soul. Actually, Sri Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur is going to talk about this in this book also, or at least indicated that, a siddha means one who has vision of the absolute reality, right? So they have all sorts of empowerment to see things. So they could see, they can go into the samadhi. Apparently, this is how it was working at one point. They can go into the samadhi and they can be gifted vision, basically, of all sorts of truths, and then they give those truths to the disciple, at least as a support for his own cultivation. This is a little bit of a it can be a little bit of a complex subject matter because, well, for starters, it depends on your view on the origin of the jiva. But as far as you know, where I stand on that, the jiva's attraction to Krishna Lila depends on his sangha. Mahasevam dwara mahurvi mukti. Mahasevam dwaram. So Mahaseva, and as we were hearing yesterday with Tamir's question, the main seva is Shravanam. So Mahasevam is the dwaram, the door to liberation, ahurvi mukti. It is a door to that super mundane world. So according to that sangha you get, the type of sadhu sangha you get, your attraction will be there. So if you're associated with an anuragi bhakta, so anuragi bhakta means a Raganuga sadhaka or siddha pranali. He is a siddha who's situated in one of the four rasas. And that is your sangha. So that means that sadhu is a doorway to your understanding of that world and your attraction to it. So then you'll also be similarly attracted in the same way as your sangha, basically. So then he's giving you something, some information, going into the samadhi, giving some information to help support the shift of identity from matter to spirit. Just like when you get a name, for example, right? The name is meant to cut off, at least to a small degree, our attachment to the psychophysical organism and the relationships therein, right? When I'm Yeshua, that is connected to a whole world of karma. By getting the name Jaya Jagannath, that world of karma is cut off. That's the spirit of it, at least, right? At the time of initiation. So the giving of a swarup is something like that. It is to assist the shift of identity from matter to spirit. And then certain particulars as you advance in that path, apparently, I don't know all the details, I've not studied it myself or practiced it, obviously. But as you advance in your own realization, certain details may need to be adjusted. But basically, it's supporting that shift of identity so you can really enter into the psyche of a Vrijvasi. Like I said, Srila Rupa Goswami himself was so vague about the thing that it gave room for expression of novelty. And this was one of the main novelties that arose in Gaudiya Vaishnava history after Srila Rupa Goswami. There was a few other ones also that have a very interesting history. But this is one of the main ones. The main one that became known as the tradition of Gaudiya Vaishnavism itself, in fact. So anyway, with all the mistakes that may have come from applying those things this way or the other, I do appreciate the courage to, shoot for the rhino. And the rhino was Braj Bhav. And so some people shot for it and they got hurt. Maybe they got killed even. But I do appreciate that courage to go for the goal of life versus the cowardliness to just be as we are. That is very cowardly. You think about that when you need to make shifts in your life. And we have cowardliness. We don't want to let go of the things that are not helping us to become better versions of ourselves, or whatever language you want to use. And we show extreme cowardliness to stay as we are, to stay in the realm of the familiar and the secure and the status quo. So in that sense, I do appreciate that courage to shoot for the right now, as Prabhupada would say. Of course, if we have to shoot for it, it's nice to have a little bit more information that would make us a little bit likely to be successful than fail. So for that reason, Sri Vishwanath has given this Rav Chandrika. So we'll hear a little bit more about this tomorrow. Okay, family. We'll stop here for today, if you don't mind. I'm gonna go lie down. Hari Om Tat Sat. Thanks a lot, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Sri Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur Ki Jai. Srila Jiva Goswami ki jai. Shri Gaur Premanandi, Hari Hari Bol. Hare Krishna, Hare Ram, Hare Krishna, Ram. Radhe